I've always been fascinated by animals and plants and exploring the natural world, and that's why I'm doing some extraordinary experiments. I will test the intelligence of an earthworm.
You're having a laugh, aren't you?
See if a gorilla can recognise herself in a mirror, and attempt to follow a very slow-moving plant.
The reason I'm doing these experiments is because Charles Darwin did them all. Darwin, the greatest biologist of all time. He carried them out to support his theory of evolution, one of the most far-reaching ideas in the history of science.
When scientists, the church and the public move in to attack his theory, Darwin's best defence is more evidence from experiments. Oops. Some are ingenious, some are about sex, and some are downright dangerous.
Oh, the pain.
When Charles Darwin moves to Kent in 1842, he turns his home, his greenhouse and the surrounding meadows into a giant laboratory and sets off on a journey into the scientific unknown. I'm going to recreate key parts of Darwin's investigations and experiments. His ambitious aim is to prove that the whole of the natural world had evolved from simpler beginnings. Darwin works on his groundbreaking theory for more than 20 years. And this was the result, The Origin of Species. 400 pages of detailed argument, evidence and ideas. It was an overnight sensation. But despite all the hard work he put into it, Darwin himself still wasn't satisfied. He always felt he needed more evidence. And for good reason. Darwin knows his theory of evolution is controversial. His book upsets hundreds of years of religious belief about creation. Only a handful of scientists support Darwin's work. Many do not. The most powerful opponent of all is the most famous zoologist in Victorian Britain, Professor Richard Owen.
Owen is a formidable enemy. He's the head of natural history at the British Museum. But he's not just a scientist, he's also a political mover and shaker. It's Owen who founded this beautiful building to house his collection. The interesting thing about the two men is that they once were close friends. In fact, Owen identified a number of fossils that Darwin brought back from his trip around the world. It was only when Darwin published his theory that Owen's feelings of friendship turned to hatred.
Richard Owen is arrogant, but he is no fool. As a scientist, he sees some merit in Darwin's work. But Owen disagrees with the explanation of the natural world that requires no God. Owen is deeply religious and incensed by Darwin's implication that man is descended from an ape. He sees Darwin as a threat to his religious beliefs and scientific eminence. He vows to kill off his theory. From now on, the two men are lifelong enemies. Darwin, on the other hand, hates any public row. He prefers to stay in the peace and quiet of his country house. Here he continues his experiments, and the tack he takes is very clever. He turns his attention to plants. He can do experiments in his greenhouse and get results quickly. For Darwin, the key questions about evolution are as relevant to plants as they are to apes and humans. But plants are much less controversial. 6 months after the publication of his book, Darwin is out for a walk. He notices a tiny plant growing in a marsh. It is called the sundew. It is one of the most bizarre plants in nature, a plant that can catch and eat insects. Darwin has to explain why this plant would evolve to do such a thing. Darwin takes the sundew back to Down House. Armed with little more than a trowel, it is in the greenhouse that Darwin will do some of his most brilliant scientific work. Head gardener Toby Beasley looks after the grounds here, and he's going to help me try to replicate Darwin's research.
Right, we're just about to go into the greenhouses and carry out some of Darwin's experiments. And it's a bit odd because I've got a whole range of different foods and bits and bobs that we're actually going to feed to some insect-eating plants, which sounds a bit crazy and a bit weird, but hopefully once we get going it should all make sense. Right, OK, Toby, I've got all the kit and I've got my notes on this experiment.
Right.
One of the foods that he fed to these plants was roast meat.
That's right.
Which I thought was really strange. Well, I brought one of my sausages already cooked.
Luckily, Darwin's notes are clear enough for me to follow.
Okay.
So the idea is we're going to chop some of this up and feed it to the plant. So it's quite small, isn't it? What's he saying here?
We're looking at something around a millimetre square. What's that, 1.2?
1.27 millimetres.
So that's tiny.
Right, OK. So let's have a little cut up here. Get as close as I can. It's really fiddly. There we go. How's that? First time I've ever fed a bit of sausage to a plant. Now, here we go. Let's see, right in the middle, do you think?
That's it, right in the middle of the leaf.
OK. Here we are. Perfect.
If Darwin's theory of evolution is correct, he has to be able to explain everything in nature, however strange or unusual. So I'm fascinated to see how he works out why the sundew plant is a carnivore.
The next thing on the list, here we've got albumin. After having tried various substances, Dr. Burden Sanderson suggested me to use cubes of albumin or hard-boiled eggs. This is turned into a bit of a full English breakfast, isn't it?
That's it. Just need the bacon next.
People must have thought, hang on a minute, what is this man doing in his greenhouse, feeding plants egg?
It might all seem crazy, but Darwin is making a brilliant leap of scientific thinking. A connection between nitrogen and insects. He first found the sundews in a marsh. All plants need nitrogen to grow, but the boggy soil of a marsh is low in nitrogen. Darwin suspects that the sundews evolved to obtain nitrogen from elsewhere. Perhaps they eat insects because insects are rich in nitrogen. But how to prove it? So just like Darwin, Toby and I offer foods with differing amounts of nitrogen to the plants. Some foods like egg white contain lots of nitrogen. Other foods, such as meat, contain a bit less. And some, none at all.
Right, so Darwin now moves on to liquids, okay. The first one we're going to use here is sugar water. Now, he states here 1 part of sugar to 73 of water, so I've got that made up already.
My sugar water contains no nitrogen. And that's the point. Darwin wants to find out if the plant chooses the food specifically for its nitrogen. I would assume the sundew would go for the sugar water, because it's energy rich.
Right, okay, a couple of drops going on. Got a nice, great big ball of it. There we are.
That's it.
So that's nice and neat. So hopefully we see how that fares. Right, so next on the list of liquids, which I didn't quite believe at first, his wee, urine.
Again, it's whatever's around the house.
Right.
You know, and in this case, it's part of him.
It is, isn't it? Right, okay, same measurements, everything else.
Right.
I haven't got it made up. So it's either you or me, and I imagine it's going to be me.
Well, if you're going to do the experiment, it's down to you, I think.
Right, okay.